I've been eyeing out this location on topographic maps for years. There are no trails into it. The only way to access it is by pack raft. So I loaded up a week of food, photography, and backpacking gear and set out on my adventure down the river. Once I got there, I set out base camp and spent 3 days looking for compositions. So I am out and on the move. It's around 1:30 p.m. Just chugged another coffee and looking to hit probably 8 miles this afternoon. The sun doesn't set till a little after 7. Time just changed, so the days are much longer again, so I feel a lot more sane. But I'm gonna see if I can find any shooting along this trail later in the day. Right now the light is just way too harsh, but if I see anything cool, I'll stop and take some pictures. Before we get into the shooting technique, let's cover a few composition and lighting tips for shooting in the forest. So here's a few different shots I took. The thing I wanted to point out about this shot is whenever you're shooting in the forest, it's essential to have what I call dappled or diffuse light. So if you look at all the parts that are getting hit with light on this shot, none of them are overly bright. So I had cloud cover up in the sky, but it was very thin. So the clouds were blocking the sun enough that it could come down and it could hit all the parts of these branches without being extremely bright and blown out. If you have really bright images, it just becomes too distracting and it looks bad. So I'm always looking for trees or anything else in the forest that's getting dappled with light, where the background that I offset it against is very dark and not getting hit with light. So if you look at all the background, like here, all these trees back here, none of them are getting hit with light. So you have this very dark backdrop, which really brings out all the detail in the foreground. I'm just gonna go through the basics of setting this one up. First, I'm gonna grab the hyperfocal focus point right in there. Just put that single point spot focus there. Zoom in at 100%. And while watching it, use the back button focus. Verify it's sharp. Zoom back out. So now there's a few different things I want to do. The first thing, I'm going to dial in my circular polarizer. So to ensure you have the best results from your polarizer, it's always good to watch the back of your screen first. So I'm just going to hold down Kelvin mode and adjust the white balance. So when I'm looking at the back of the screen, I want to make sure it looks as close as possible to the scene in front of me that I'm shooting. So I just want to match what my eye sees out there to what my eye sees on the back of the camera. So I can go warmer, cooler, balance right in the middle. No right or wrong, just want to neutralize. So that looks good. Now I'm just going to watch the back of the screen, and I'm going to turn the circular polarizer while watching the back of the screen. So I normally just run it around and try to get in a habit of twisting it this way to your left, because then it won't get unscrewed from going the other way. So I always just get in a habit of that. But I'm just turning it left, watching the back of the screen, and I just care about the optimal looking image. So whenever it looks best to my eye, looks good right there, then I stop turning it and it's all set. So after those are dialed in, I can look at the scene and say, what f-stop do I need for this scene? So I'm just looking at the depth of field here. The image starts immediate foreground and it ends way back there. So I would say f11 would work well for this shot. I could also use f16 if I find that something in the foreground's not sharp while shooting a hyperfocal. Or I could also just go with a focus stacked image. So there's two options. I would do both when you're first learning it and compare and contrast. And then eventually you'll get better and better at knowing when to use which. So I'm going to go with f11 here to start with. Focus at hyperfocal. Starting at base ISO 100. And I'll pull my histogram up. With exposure compensation, I always get in the habit in the forest of just darkening it way down. Then I can make sure there's nothing clipped off the edge here that I couldn't see. So I want this thing as dark as possible. Then from there, I can go up in exposure compensation. And the histogram will shift right. I just want to touch the right hand or brightest edge of the histogram to the pure white, which is the right hand edge of the histogram. So right there. Now, have bright yellow and bright green from the sun dappling on all that moss there and there. And from past experience, I just know that those colors blow out really quickly. So When I'm seeing light in the forest and things are getting dappled in sunlight and it's moss or something yellow or green, I'm always just going up to the right there. And then with exposure compensation, I'll just back down. You can watch it right here or right here. One stop. And that ensures that I won't blow out yellow or green. Now, if you guys have watched my exposed to the right video, I discussed how that's just a JPEG rendering of the RGB or raw histogram. So it compresses down the highlights and the shadows a lot. So I could probably expose all the way to the right on this histogram and it would be just fine. But depending on your camera's dynamic range, it's going to be differently. So I always tell people to start out by backing off that stop for yellow or green, and then to test your camera also with an exposure to the right, and you can see how it looks. So we can do that here, but you can also check out that exposed to the right video. So here's the shot that I just set up, exposed to the right and then backing down a full stop off of white. So you can see that the red right here and the green and the yellow are just barely touching the edge up here at the top at white, but they're not blowing out. So the image looks overly bright, brighter than I actually saw while out there shooting. But you can see the only thing that's clipped is the highlights right here. Even if I zoom in here, you can see there's these really bright highlights. They appear clipped on the back of your computer screen or on your camera. But what you'll notice is if you darken these down, you actually still retained all that highlight detail. So the best of both worlds happens with exposed to the right, because if I zoom back out here and I look at this image, when I'm importing these to my Lightroom catalog, I automatically apply this raw import preset. And what it does is it just darkens the exposure a half a stop. It pulls the highlights and whites down and pulls the shadows up a little bit. So the image now looks exactly what I saw while shooting in the field. The nice part about this is if I would have exposed regularly, meaning underexposed the image or not used exposed to the right, then when I try to pull up all the shadows on the dark areas, they wouldn't have looked good. But now you can see that if I pull up the shadows here, since it was exposed to the right in the field, they're really clean shadows. There's not noise, there's not color degradation. It's because I overexposed in the field using exposed to the right. So using this exposed to the right technique, I get the best of both worlds. Number one, I get all the highlight details captured without blowing them out. Number two, I get a bunch of shadow details that I wouldn't have gotten if I would have exposed, say, a stop or two darker with a regular exposure that was not exposed to the right. So let's jump back into the shooting technique. So I'm going to go with base ISO of 100 here, 64, 100, either one works. And then aperture priority gives me 1/2 of a second. I'm always just scanning the scene and I'm asking myself, does shutter speed matter? Here, it could matter if the tree's moving, the moss is moving, anything in the foreground's moving. So if I see it's not moving, shutter speed doesn't matter. But if it is moving, shutter speed does matter. I see that it's not moving, so I'm just going to leave ISO at 100, giving me 1/2 of a second. But if I did need a faster shutter speed, all I would do is grab my ISO, and as I increase ISO, you can see shutter speed gets faster and faster. Now I would go up to 400 for this scene and be comfortable with it, but I would rather shoot at base. So if I needed the faster shutter speed, that's how to do it. Aperture priority holds that constant exposure there. And even when the light changes on this scene, aperture priority will hold that same value of exposure, and it'll change your shutter speed for you. As the light gets brighter, the shutter speed would automatically get faster to hold that same histogram value. So I'm all happy with these settings here. Everything looks good. So I'll hit the shutter button, mirror up mode, 3-second timer. So that's how I would take everything into consideration for shooting a forest scene like this. So here's another example of an exposed to the right image. I was out shooting in the mountains and I had really dark contrast between the darks here and the highlights here. Now, if I pull this down or use my import preset right here, it pulls it down a little bit. But what you're going to notice here is if I start to edit this image, you can actually see Mount Rainier back here. But as I pull the exposure down, I can also pull the whites up, control the highlights, and then pull the lights up. And then you start to actually see all the color that's underlined in this image. And what I want to point out here, let me control the color balance a little bit just with a quick edit. What I want to point out here is how high of quality all the dark details are in an image like this. So if I pull up the shadows here, you can see that I have all of my dark details down here, and there's no image degradation, especially over here in the shadows. If I would have done a regular exposure for this specific shot, I would have lost all this shadow detail. So when I just did that quick edit that you just saw, and I pull up the shadows, this would have looked really nasty here and here. Now, that doesn't mean you have to use the shadows. You can use them really dark in your final edit, whatever you want them to be. But the key here is that when you're actually exposing these images in the field, by keeping them bright without blowing out the highlights, you're getting all this shadow detail that you wouldn't have had otherwise, and then you can either throw it away and keep it darker, or you can use it if you need it. But there's no downside because you're still capturing all the highlights without blowing them out. So I'm just going to check the focus on this. First, I'll just check at my focal point where I put that initial single point spot focus. And I'll check foreground. It's sharp. It's probably acceptably sharp, but it could probably be a little bit sharper. Background's real sharp. So if I wanted to here to make that even sharper, since I already have one exposure, I could just refocus there, but I think I'm just going to go up to f16 and I'll go back to -1 in exposure compensation. Gives me a 1 second shutter speed. Still scanning the scene to make sure I don't care about shutter speed. Foreground is now acceptably sharp for sure. So that's the f16. The other option is just to take the focus box and move it over here to this tree. And this would be the focus stacking option. So we can compare and contrast both back on the computer. So I'm just going to zoom in at 100%, back button focus. I can't tell if it's perfect, so I'm just going to grab the focal ring and I'm going to watch the back of the screen while turning the focal ring. Turn it left, turn it right, and then I can see the optimal point or the sharpest point in the middle. Sometimes you have to do that, sometimes you don't, but it's always good to have an eye out for it. I'm going to go back to f11 here. That'll ensure I'm sharp there, and that the depth of field extends beyond where the sharpness dropped off in the previous image. Everything else I can leave the same. So let's take a look at the f16 image versus the focus stack version of the f11 image. Now, if I'm shooting light like this, I just brighten this up so you can see it, so it's still correctly exposed. But if I'm shooting light where it's changing quickly, and I'm not sure if a few seconds later the lighting on the scene is going to be the same, I'm always going to choose shooting f16 over the focus stacked image. So if we look at this one, I was focused right in here at hyperfocal. You guys can check out my hyperfocal video on YouTube. Just Google Dave Morrow and hyperfocal distance. But the hyperfocal is sharp for the entire depth of field. So it covers all the way in here, all the way to the background of the scene. So you also have this f11 image where this is the first shot. It was focused right in here, and the focus started to drop off back in here. You can see that's not very sharp. So I refocused another shot down here, and you can see it's sharp now. Now, the big problem with focus stacking in the forest is you can see, if I look at these two different images, the lighting is different on each of them, so it can be very hard to blend them together. So whenever you're shooting in the forest or under quickly changing light, stay away from focus stacking and just go with an f16 image to increase your depth of field. All right, I think I'm happy with the images I got here. It's been 20 minutes now, and the initial light I got and photographed is gone and hasn't been back for 20 minutes, so I need to keep hiking, or I'm going to be hiking a lot in dark, so I'm going to pack up and get back on the trail. But I think these are going to be some pretty cool images, but that's what I say every time, so we'll see.